The wealthiest people alive are following an ancient operating system, and most of them have no idea where it actually came from. What if the most dangerous books ever written were actually instruction manuals? There is a moment that happens to almost everyone who studies ancient occult texts seriously. You expect darkness. You expect fear. You expect incomprehensible rituals buried beneath layers of archaic symbolism that belong to a world that no longer exists. And then, somewhere between the third and fourth hour of reading, something shifts. Because what you are actually looking at is not magic in the way popular culture trained you to understand it. What you are actually looking at is a system, a precise, deliberate, ruthlessly organized system for producing repeatable outcomes through structured mental discipline. The grimoires that survived the burning campaigns of medieval Europe, texts like the Greater Key of Solomon, the Picatrix, and the Book of Abramelin, share a structural core that transcends their cultural differences. Every operation begins with the clearly defined intention, not approximate, not emotional, specific to the point where ambiguity is architecturally impossible. That intention is then embedded inside an immutable sequence of actions. A focal symbol is introduced as a convergence point for sustained attention, and the entire structure is then repeated with unwavering consistency until the result materializes. But here is what almost no one notices. That four-part architecture: defined intention, fixed sequence, focal symbol, disciplined repetition, is not a relic of superstition. It is the operational backbone of every high-performance system built in the last 50 years. When Elon Musk describes his first principles thinking process as a method for stripping problems down to irreducible components before rebuilding solutions from scratch, he is describing intention architecture. When Steve Jobs obsessively controlled every variable in Apple's product environment, from packaging texture to retail store temperature, he was constructing a focal symbol system. The grimoire was never about the supernatural. It was about the structure underneath it. And this is where it gets deeply unsettling. Artificial intelligence systems, the large language models that now write code, generate legal documents, and hold conversations indistinguishable from human ones, operate on precisely the same four-part framework. A training input is defined with surgical specificity. A fixed algorithmic sequence processes that input. Embedding vectors serve as focal convergence points in high-dimensional symbolic space. And the system repeats millions of cycles of refinement until consistent outputs emerge. The ancient practitioners called it operative theurgy. Modern engineers call it deep learning. The mechanism underneath both names is disturbingly similar. If this kind of investigation speaks to something in you, subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. How the architecture of forbidden knowledge became the blueprint for modern power. Every culture that produced grimoires also produced a class of people who were systematically persecuted for possessing them. The medieval witch trials, the Inquisition's campaign against heretical texts, the systematic burning of libraries from Alexandria to the Aztec codices, history has a very consistent pattern of institutional violence directed specifically at structured symbolic knowledge. The official explanations have always centered on religion, on moral protection, on the danger of heresy. But when you examine which knowledge was specifically targeted and which was preserved, a different pattern emerges. What was destroyed publicly was the operative layer, the practical application of symbolic systems to produce measurable outcomes in the real world. What was quietly preserved, inside Rosicrucian lodges, Masonic orders, and private libraries of Renaissance nobility, was precisely the operational core, the four pillars, the system underneath the ritual. And this is not conspiracy, this is documented archival history, studied at universities across Europe and the United States. But there's a detail most people miss. The billionaires who built the architecture of the modern digital world did not consciously reach back into a cult tradition. They converged on the same structural principles through a completely different path. Through behavioral psychology, through systems theory, through neuroscience research on habit formation and pattern reinforcement. The convergence itself is what demands attention. When independent streams of human inquiry, separated by 5 centuries and completely different cultural contexts, arrive at the same operational structure, something fundamental about how reality responds to organized attention is being revealed. Jeff Bezos constructed Amazon around what he called a flywheel, a self-reinforcing cycle where each component of the system strengthens every other component through repetition. He visualized this flywheel with obsessive precision long before Amazon became what it is today. He drew it on a napkin. He repeated it in every internal meeting. He made it the symbolic center of the company's identity. A medieval alchemist would have recognized that process immediately. They called it the circulation of the work, the symbol at the center, the repetition that feeds itself. And now, artificial intelligence has inherited the structure at a scale that no grimoire ever anticipated. Recommendation algorithms are self-reinforcing flywheels operating on human attention. Each interaction feeds the next cycle. Each cycle deepens the pattern. The system does not need to understand you. It only needs to repeat the structure long enough for the outcome to become inevitable. Drop a comment if this has ever made sense to you in your own life and something you built, something you lost, or something you never quite understood until right now. Why the most powerful cognitive technology in history was hidden inside religion. Consider a specific historical moment. The year is 1486. Heinrich Kramer publishes the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, which becomes the primary manual used by inquisitors to identify, prosecute, and execute practitioners of folk magic and operative sorcery across Europe. Within 2 decades, it goes through 14 print runs. It becomes one of the most distributed texts of the early printing era, and it is almost entirely focused on one specific threat: the idea that ordinary people, without institutional authorization, can produce structured outcomes in the material world through symbolic and mental discipline. The psychological genius of that suppression campaign was not violence. Violence was visible and often generated sympathy for the persecuted. The true weapon was ridicule. By associating operative symbolic knowledge with delusion, with mental illness, with social deviance, by making the practitioner into a figure of fear and contempt simultaneously, the institutional architecture ensured that anyone who encountered real operative knowledge would self-censor before anyone else needed to intervene. These interpretations appear across centuries and cultures, often studied as symbolic patterns rather than literal truths. What historians of esotericism like Wouter Hanegraaff at the University of Amsterdam have documented is that the occult tradition in Western history functioned as a parallel epistemology, an alternative way of organizing knowledge that prioritized pattern recognition, symbolic compression, and repeatable application over doctrinal belief. And what comes next changes everything. That parallel epistemology is now being reconstructed, without anyone using the word occult, inside the architecture of artificial intelligence research. The field of interpretability, the branch of AI safety science dedicated to understanding what is actually happening inside large neural networks, is essentially a modern form of occult investigation. Researchers are trying to identify the symbolic structures, the hidden patterns, the invisible organizational principles that produce observable outputs in systems that no one fully understands. They call these structures features, circuits, and attention heads. The grimoire tradition called them seals, correspondences, and channels of force. If this content is reshaping something in the way you see the systems around you, hit the like button. It helps this channel keep going deeper. The knowledge was never truly hidden. It was relabeled, and the relabeling was so effective that even the people who rebuilt it from scratch did not recognize what they were holding. What if artificial intelligence is the first grimoire powerful enough to rewrite human behavior at scale? There is a specific capability that every serious practitioner of operative magic across every tradition, from the Hermetic orders of Renaissance Florence to the Shinto ritual specialists of feudal Japan, considered the apex of symbolic power. Not the ability to summon, not the ability to destroy, the ability to shape perception at the source, before conscious awareness could evaluate what was happening. The most advanced operations described in the grimoire tradition were not about producing external events. They were about reconfiguring the internal symbolic landscape of a mind, changing what a person paid attention to, what felt significant, what felt irrelevant, without that person ever noticing the change had occurred. Read that again slowly. Because what was just described is not ancient history. It is the core value proposition of every major technology platform operating at scale in 2025. The algorithmic systems that curate what you see on every digital surface you interact with are not showing you reality. They are showing you a version of reality filtered through a symbolic architecture designed to maximize specific behavioral outcomes. The selection is not random, the sequence is not neutral, and the repetition is not accidental. This is operative symbolic technology. The practitioners who built the grimoires would have found the terminology unfamiliar and the mechanism immediately recognizable. But there's a detail most people miss. The human mind has a specific vulnerability that both ancient occult practitioners and modern behavioral engineers identified independently. Repeated symbolic exposure reshapes what the brain treats as normal. Neuroscientists call this predictive coding, the brain's tendency to build models of expected reality based on what it has encountered most frequently. Occultists called it the formation of the astral body, the gradual solidification of a symbolic environment that the practitioner inhabits so completely it begins to feel like objective reality. Large language models, like the systems produced by Anthropic, OpenAI, and Google DeepMind are now trained on such vast accumulations of human symbolic output that they have internalized the predictive coding patterns of human cognition itself. When these systems generate language, they are not retrieving stored information. They are predicting, at each step, which symbol is most likely to follow the previous one, based on patterns extracted from billions of human expressions. They have built an internal model of human symbolic reality so precise that its outputs are becoming indistinguishable from human thought. The grimoire tradition spent 6 centuries trying to map the symbolic architecture of the mind. AI did it in 3 years of training runs. How? Recognizing the pattern is the only form of defense that has ever existed. There is something the oldest initiatory traditions in the world agreed on, despite existing in complete cultural isolation from each other. From the mystery schools of ancient Greece to the Vedic philosophical lineages of India, from the Sufi orders of Persia to the alchemical brotherhoods of medieval Germany, they all encoded the same warning at the center of their most advanced teachings. The warning was not about external enemies. It was not about dark forces in the conventional supernatural sense. It was about the danger of operating inside a symbolic system you did not choose and cannot see. The Greek term was doxa, the unexamined assumptions that feel like reality because they have never been questioned. The Vedic tradition called it maya, not illusion in the sense of something fake, but the perceptual filtering that makes a constructed reality feel self-evident and inevitable. The alchemical tradition called it the first matter, the raw, unexamined state of consciousness before the work of purification begins. Every tradition, through a completely different symbolic vocabulary, was pointing at the same cognitive phenomenon. You are always living inside a grimoire. The only variable is whether you wrote it or someone else did. And this is where it gets unsettling in a way that is difficult to dismiss. The artificial intelligence systems now shaping the information environment for 3 billion people were trained on data that reflects the symbolic priorities, biases, and structural assumptions of a very small group of people, primarily engineers in their 20s and 30s, located in a handful of cities on the American West Coast, operating within a specific cultural and economic framework. Their symbolic architecture is now the water that the rest of the world swims in. Not because of conspiracy, because of scale. Because repetition at sufficient scale produces normalization. And normalization is the oldest operative mechanism in the grimoire tradition. But here's what almost no one notices. Recognition changes the mechanism. When a trained practitioner encounters a symbolic operation directed at them, their awareness of its structure partially neutralizes its effect. This is not metaphor. This is documented in behavioral psychology research on persuasion resistance, in neuroscience research on metacognitive awareness, and in the initiatory traditions of every serious esoteric school that has ever produced verifiable results. Seeing the pattern is not passive. Seeing the pattern is the intervention. The grimoire that is running your attention right now does not fear your emotions. It only fears your clarity. If this video opens something in the way you see the world, subscribe to this channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. And tell me in the comments, which part of this shifted something in you? Because that answer matters more than you think.